My husband filed for divorce after 40 years of marriage. You'll be left with nothing. My lawyer slammed his fist on the table. Don't give up. But I quietly took the pen and signed everything. He smirked, but he forgot that. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I remember the smell of that conference room more clearly than I remember most of my wedding day. Bleach and stale coffee and something underneath it all, like old paper and dried up hope. I was 63 years old, sitting in a gray chair that was too low for the table, and across from me sat the man I had loved since I was 22. Except by then I wasn't sure I recognized him at all. My name is Dorothy Elaine Marsh. Dot, most people called me. And for 40 years, I had been Dorothy Elaine Hargrove, wife of Richard Allen Hargrove, mother of his 2 children, keeper of his home, bookkeeper of his small landscaping company, and, as it turned out, the last person to understand what had been happening right under my own roof. Let me go back to the beginning, because nothing about that conference room made sense without it. Richard and I met in 1982 at a church picnic in Denton, Texas. He was 26, lean and tan, with a laugh that made you feel like you were the funniest person alive. I was 22 and finishing a degree in accounting at the community college. We married 9 months later. We weren't in a rush, we just knew. At least I thought we both knew. For most of those 40 years, life was ordinary in the best possible way. We raised our son, Patrick, and our daughter, Melissa, in a 4-bedroom house in Garland, a suburb of Dallas. Richard built his landscaping business from a single truck and a used mower into a company with 11 employees and 3 commercial contracts. I kept the books, raised the children, and somewhere in there became the person who made everything run. I didn't mind. That was what I understood partnership to mean. But about 4 years before that conference room, things began to shift in ways I told myself were just age, just stress, just the natural cooling of a long marriage. Richard started working late, not unusual for a small business owner. But then the late nights started having a particular texture. He would come home smelling of cologne he hadn't worn in years, a sharp cedar scent I didn't buy him. He started going to the gym, which was fine, except he had never cared about the gym in his life. He bought new shirts. He started locking his phone. These things arrived one at a time, and one at a time, I explained them away. Then, about 2 years in, our daughter Melissa let something slip at Thanksgiving. She'd meant it as an innocent comment. Something about seeing her father having lunch with that woman from his client account. She caught herself and changed the subject fast. I let her. I wasn't ready. I was 61 years old. I had no income of my own. I had worked as an unpaid bookkeeper for the family business for decades, never drawing a formal salary. Our house was in both our names, but the business was in Richard's name alone. I had a small personal savings account with about $14,000 I had accumulated by quietly setting aside cash over years, the way women of my mother's generation taught their daughters to do without ever explaining why. I understood why now. I want to be honest with you. I was afraid, not of being alone. I had learned to be alone inside that marriage long before Richard filed any papers. I was afraid of being erased, of being 63 years old and walking out of 40 years with nothing that the law would recognize as mine. The day Richard asked me to sit down at the kitchen table and told me he was filing for divorce, he didn't look guilty. That surprised me. He looked like a man who had made a business decision and was informing a vendor the contract was ending. He slid a folder across the table. His attorney had already prepared a proposed settlement. The house would be sold. The proceeds would be split. The business, valued per his attorney's assessment at approximately $80,000, would remain entirely his. I would receive no spousal support because, as the document noted, I was capable of employment. I was 63 years old and had never held a formal job in my adult life. My attorney was a woman named Carol Fitch, And she was not a quiet woman. When I brought her that folder, she read it at her desk, set it down, and hit the table with her closed fist. Not in anger, in emphasis. "Dorothy," she said, "do not sign a single thing. This is insultingly low. We can get you the house outright, a share of the business valuation and spousal support for at least 7 years. Do not give this man what he wants." I heard her. I understood her. And 2 weeks later, in that gray conference room, I picked up the pen and signed everything Richard's attorney had originally proposed. Richard's attorney tried to hide his relief. Richard himself didn't bother. He smiled. A small, certain smile. The smile of a man who had just gotten away with something. My own attorney was furious. She leaned toward me and whispered, "Dorothy, what are you doing?" What I was doing was something Richard had forgotten was possible. He had forgotten, after 40 years, to wonder what I actually knew. And I knew quite a lot. I drove home alone that afternoon. Carol had stopped speaking to me by the time we reached the elevator. Not out of cruelty, but out of a kind of professional grief. She had tried to fight for me, and I had, from her perspective, simply surrendered. She didn't understand. I didn't explain. Not yet. The house was quiet when I got back. Richard had already moved most of his things to the apartment he'd apparently been renting since March. I'd found the lease agreement 3 weeks earlier while looking for a receipt in his desk drawer, which told me the planning had been going on longer than his kitchen table announcement had suggested. A man doesn't rent an apartment before he's told his wife he's leaving unless he's very sure of the outcome he expects. I sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a cup of coffee, and I did what I had always done when I was frightened. I made a list. What I had: a house worth approximately $340,000, now headed for sale. $14,000 in my personal savings. No formal employment history. A Social Security record that was thin because I had deferred to Richard's income for our entire marriage. A daughter who lived in Austin and called twice a week. A son who lived 20 minutes away and had, in recent months, become notably distant. A fact I had filed away without examining too closely. What Richard had: the business, the commercial accounts, 11 employees, 3 trucks, equipment, a client list built over decades, and, this was the part that mattered, financial records I had personally maintained for 22 years. Here is what Richard had forgotten about me. I am an accountant by training. I may never have held a formal title, but I had kept every receipt, every invoice, every bank statement, every payroll record for Hargrove Landscaping since 1995. I had done this because I was thorough, because I was organized, and because, somewhere in the back of my mind, in a place I had never let myself look directly, I had always known that a woman without a formal salary needed to understand exactly what she was owed. Over the years, I had noticed things in the books, expenses that were personal, not business. A company credit card used at restaurants I'd never been to, at hotels in cities. Richard had claimed to visit alone for client meetings. Equipment purchases that didn't match the inventory. And beginning about 3 years before the divorce, a pattern I had documented carefully, but never confronted. A gradual shifting of revenue through a secondary LLC Richard had formed, Hargrove Property Services, that I had not been asked to help manage. The revenue flowing into that LLC had been growing quietly for 2 years. It was not showing up in our joint tax return. I want to be very clear. I am not a dramatic person. I did not make a decision that afternoon to destroy Richard or to wage some kind of war. What I decided, sitting at that kitchen table with my legal pad, was that I was not going to walk away from 40 years of unpaid labor with a split on a house sale and nothing else. What I had signed in that conference room was not my surrender. It was my opening move. The proposed settlement I had signed gave Richard a false sense that the matter was resolved. As long as he believed I was defeated, he would stop being careful. And a man who stops being careful with money leaves tracks. My first step was practical. I called Carol Fitch the next morning and asked her if we could meet. She agreed, reluctantly. When I sat down across from her and explained, calmly, with the legal pad in front of me, what I had documented over 22 years of bookkeeping, she was quiet for a long moment. "Dorothy," she said finally, "why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I needed him to think it was over," I said. She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, "We can file a motion to set aside the settlement agreement on grounds of fraud if we can show he deliberately concealed assets. That is not a small thing. Are you prepared for what that means?" I told her I was. What it meant, in practical terms, was this. We would need a forensic accountant. We would need to subpoena the records of Hargrove Property Services. We would need to demonstrate that Richard had, during the divorce proceedings, failed to fully disclose his assets as required by Texas family law. Failure to disclose assets in a divorce is not just a civil matter. Depending on the degree, it can constitute fraud. Carol referred me to a forensic accountant named Gerald Townsend. I met him the following Tuesday in a small office near downtown Dallas. He was a quiet man in his mid-50s, methodical and unhurried, which I respected immediately. I brought him 2 years of bank statements I had photographed with my phone before ever signing anything in that conference room. I had also brought him the Articles of Organization for Hargrove Property Services, which were public record, and a spreadsheet I had assembled over the previous 6 months, tracking revenue discrepancies between the main business account and the LLC. Gerald Townsend looked at my documents for 20 minutes. Then he looked up at me. "Mrs. Marsh," he said. I had already gone back to my maiden name, at least in my own mind. "Did your husband know you had these?" "No," I said. "He forgot that I was the one who kept the books." Gerald nodded slowly and picked up his pen. Gerald Townsend filed his preliminary report 6 weeks later. I remember the morning it arrived. I was drinking coffee at the same kitchen table where Richard had told me our marriage was over, in the house that was technically still both of ours while the settlement paperwork wound through the courts. The early Texas spring light was coming through the window above the sink, and the yard, which Richard's own crew had maintained for years, was starting to look neglected. Nobody had trimmed the crepe myrtles. Nobody had edged the driveway. Small things. But I noticed. The report was 41 pages. Gerald's conclusion, stated in careful professional language, was that Hargrove Property Services had received approximately $214,000 in redirected revenue over a period of 28 months. Revenue that originated from Hargrove Landscaping's commercial contracts, but had been invoiced through the LLC to avoid appearing in the main business accounts. This money had not been disclosed in Richard's sworn financial affidavit filed as part of the divorce proceedings. $214,000. And that was only what Gerald could trace in the records I had provided. He noted that a full forensic audit with subpoena access to both entities' complete financial records would likely reveal a larger figure. Carol filed the motion to set aside the settlement agreement the following Monday. The legal basis was fraudulent concealment of assets. The motion was accompanied by Gerald's preliminary report and an affidavit from me detailing my role as the de facto bookkeeper of Hargrove Landscaping for over 2 decades, establishing my standing to testify about the financial irregularities. Richard was served on a Wednesday. I know this because Patrick called me that Wednesday evening. My son. The one who had been distant. He didn't call often anymore, and when he did, the conversations were careful, shorter than they used to be, with a particular quality of omission, the way people talk when they're watching what they say. I had noticed this. I had not pressed it. "Mom," he said, "what exactly are you doing?" "I'm making sure I receive what I'm owed from 40 years of marriage," I said. There was a pause. "Dad says you signed a settlement." "I did sign a settlement," I said. "That settlement is now under legal review." Another pause. He's pretty upset, Mom." I thought about everything I wanted to say to my son in that moment. I thought about the years I had driven him to baseball practice and helped him with his college applications and loaned him money after his first divorce. Money that had quietly come from that $14,000 account I'd built in $20 increments over 30 years. I thought about the fact that in the past 8 months, as his father's plans had clearly been taking shape, Patrick had become his father's son in ways that went beyond genetics. "I imagine he is," I said. "I hope you're doing well, Patrick. Good night." I hung up and sat with the feeling for a while. It was grief, mostly, not rage. Grief has a different weight, but something else happened that week that mattered more than Patrick's phone call. Gerald Townsend called me the day after Carol filed the motion and asked if I had ever heard the name Sandra Kowalski. I told him I hadn't. He told me that Hargrove Property Services listed a Sandra Kowalski as a 50% member of the LLC. I went still. I looked up Sandra Kowalski that evening. It wasn't difficult. She had a LinkedIn profile. She was 41 years old. She worked in commercial real estate, and she had a professional headshot that showed a woman who was attractive in a careful, deliberate way, with dark hair and the kind of confident smile that comes from knowing how a room looks at you. She had been listed as a member of Hargrove Property Services since its formation nearly 3 years ago. Not a business partner, not a client. A co-owner of a company Richard had built specifically to divert revenue from our marriage. A company he had formed with a woman during our marriage, which he had never once mentioned to me. I printed her photo. I put it in the folder with Gerald's report. I sat with that folder on the kitchen table, and I made myself feel the full weight of it, not to wallow, but because I had learned that unexplored grief becomes something bitter and useless, and I couldn't afford to be either. Then I closed the folder and called Carol. "I need you to add Sandra Kowalski to the subpoena list," I said. Carol didn't ask why. She already knew. "Done," she said. This was the moment I understood there was no going back. Not because I had decided anything dramatic, but because the facts themselves had made the road one direction only. Richard had not simply deceived me in the ordinary ways that people deceive each other in failing marriages. He had built a legal entity with another woman, using money from a company I had helped build, during a marriage I had spent 40 years maintaining. And he had done it quietly and carefully, and with the expectation that I would never look closely enough to find it. He had forgotten what I was, and now the court was going to remember for him. The subpoenas went out on a Thursday morning in late April. By Saturday afternoon, Richard called me directly for the first time since the conference room. I was in the backyard pulling weeds along the fence line, something I had found myself doing more often, the physical work of it, the uncomplicated satisfaction of clearing things out. My phone buzzed in my apron pocket, and I looked at the screen and felt nothing particular. I answered, "Dorothy." His voice was controlled. Richard was always controlled when he was furious. He had learned early in our marriage that raising his voice lost him arguments, so he had trained himself into a kind of smooth, quiet authority that he used to great effect in business and, I realized now, in our marriage. "I think we need to talk about what you're doing." "We have attorneys," I said. "Talk to Carol." "This has gone past attorneys," he said. "You're making accusations that could damage a legitimate business. You're dragging in people who have nothing to do with our marriage. I want you to think very carefully about what you're setting in motion." I pulled another weed. "I'm listening." "I'm prepared to revise the settlement," he said. "Significantly. I want you to be comfortable, Dorothy. I never wanted you to walk away with nothing. If you withdraw the motion, I'll offer you $150,000 cash, plus the house. You can stay in the house, no sale. The money is yours outright. I stood up and brushed the dirt from my gloves. $150,000, and the house was, by any measure, a better offer than what I'd originally signed. Substantially better. I understood that it also represented the precise amount Richard believed would make me go away, which told me quite clearly that what Gerald had found was only the surface. I'll let Carol know you're open to discussion, I said. Good night, Richard. He hung up without responding. The real escalation came the following Tuesday. I was in Carol's office when her assistant knocked and said there were 2 men in the lobby asking to speak with me. Carol went out first. She came back in looking tight around the mouth. One of them says he's Richard's brother, she said. The other one is a man named Kowalski, Sandra's brother. I had not expected that. I want to be honest about that. It caught me off guard. The idea that Sandra Kowalski's family had become involved, which meant that Sandra herself was far more embedded in this than I had fully processed. She wasn't a woman Richard had taken up with after our marriage fell apart. She was a woman who had been building something with him for 3 years, and she had family who felt proprietary enough about the outcome to show up at my attorney's office. Carol's recommendation was to have them escorted out. I said I would speak with them for 5 minutes in the lobby, with Carol present. Richard's brother, Dale, was a man I had known for 40 years and never particularly liked. He was big and blunt and had the family talent for presenting aggression as concern. He told me, standing in the lobby of a law office on a Tuesday afternoon, that I was making a serious mistake. That what I thought I had found in those financial records was not what I thought it was. That Richard had been advised by his attorney that my methodology in compiling financial evidence could be challenged. That things could get very unpleasant. The other man, Frank Kowalski, Sandra's older brother, said less, but watched me with the deliberate attention of someone who wanted me to notice he was watching. He said one thing directly. My sister's business interests are not part of your divorce, Mrs. Hargrove. It's Mrs. Marsh, I said, and that's for the court to determine. Carol put her hand on my arm. We went back inside. We did not offer them coffee. I drove home afterward and sat in my car in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. I want to be truthful. I was shaken, not broken, not wavering, but shaken the way you are when something theoretical becomes physical and present. When men stand in front of you and make you understand that they would prefer you not exist as a legal entity or otherwise. I was 63 years old, and I had spent my life being accommodating, and there was a particular kind of tiredness that came with the understanding that accommodation had not protected me at all. I called Melissa that evening. My daughter, the one who had moved to Austin and called twice a week, and had, unlike her brother, been consistently kind. She listened to everything. She said, "Mom, do you need me to come?" "Not yet," I said, "but knowing you'd come helps." Carol called the next morning. Frank Kowalski's appearance in the lobby had been a mistake on their part. It confirmed, as she put it, that Sandra Kowalski was not a passive party in this situation, but an active one, which strengthened our argument that the LLC had been a coordinated effort and not merely a business decision. An attorney for Hargrove Property Services had contacted Carol that afternoon and indicated that Ms. Kowalski would be seeking separate legal representation, which was, Carol said, exactly what we'd hoped for. Separate attorneys meant separate interests. Separate interests meant somebody was eventually going to blink. After the call, I did something I had not allowed myself to do since all of this began. I closed the curtains in the living room, made a cup of tea, and sat in the good chair by the window and did nothing for 3 days. I read a novel. I watched birds at the feeder in the backyard. I slept more than 8 hours 2 nights in a row. I let myself be tired. I had earned 3 days, and I was going to need my strength. The revised offer arrived via Richard's attorney on a Friday. $175,000, the house, and a waiver of any future claims against Hargrove Landscaping or its affiliated entities. The last clause was the tell. A man confident in his legal position does not need the other party to waive future claims. He needs that clause precisely because he knows there is more to find. I read it at the kitchen table with my reading glasses on and my coffee going cold beside me, and I felt something I can only describe as clarity. Not excitement, not triumph. Just the clean, flat certainty of a person who can see the shape of a thing and knows she is looking at it straight. I wrote one sentence on a notepad. They are afraid. I gave it to Carol the following morning with the instruction to decline. Richard called me himself 2 days later. He had dropped the controlled tone. He sounded tired, which I recognized. It was the tiredness of a man who had expected a short transaction and found himself in a longer one. "Dorothy," he said, "what is it you actually want? Give me a number." "This isn't about a number," I said. "Everything is about a number," he said. "You believe that," I said. "That's part of the problem." He made a sound, frustration, not quite anger. "You're being irrational." "I'm being precise," I said. "That's always made you uncomfortable." He hung up. I put the phone down on the counter and stood for a moment in the kitchen of the house where I had raised 2 children and cooked approximately 20,000 meals and balanced the books of a business I never officially owned. And I felt, for the first time in months, something very close to peace. Not happiness, that would come later, but peace. The kind that comes from knowing you are doing the right thing in the right way, and you cannot be talked out of it. Sandra made a more elegant attempt. A handwritten note arrived at the house. I still don't know how she knew the address, though the answer was obvious, expressing her wish to meet woman to woman and resolve this privately, without lawyers turning it into something ugly. The handwriting was careful. The tone was calibrated. Not apologetic, but warm in a studied way. The warmth of someone who had practiced it. I read it once and put it in the folder. I want to tell you what it felt like to be the subject of those approaches, because I think it matters. There is a particular kind of pressure that comes when people believe you can be purchased or softened, and it comes with an implicit message. You are small enough that a number or a kind word will reach you. Richard, offering money, believed I would take the money. Sandra, writing a careful note, believed I was a woman whose emotions could be redirected by the right appeal. Both of them had known me for years in different ways, and neither of them had actually seen me. It was, in a strange way, freeing. The support I found was not dramatic. It didn't arrive in a single decisive moment. It accumulated the way good things usually do. My friend Pat Del Vecchio, we had been friends since our children were in elementary school together, 25 years at minimum, came over one evening with a bottle of wine and the kind of presence that requires no explanation. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Tell me everything from the beginning." I did. She listened without interrupting, which is rarer than people think. When I was finished, she said, "He never deserved you." I told her that wasn't useful thinking. She said, "No, but it's true, and sometimes true things don't have to be useful." Melissa drove up from Austin that weekend. She was 40 now, practical and steady in a way that had always made me quietly proud. She organized my filing system, bought me a new printer, and made me eat actual meals for 2 days rather than the toast and soup I had been subsisting on. She did not tell me what to do. She did not ask if I was sure. She simply treated the situation as one her mother had under control, which was, I realized, exactly the form of support I needed. And Gerald Townsend, who was not a friend but was becoming something close to an ally, called midweek to tell me that the subpoena response from Hargrove Property Services had arrived, and it was incomplete. Incomplete how? I asked. There are 18 months of bank statements missing from what they've produced, he said. Either they were never kept, which seems unlikely given the nature of the LLC, or they have not been provided. What happens next? I said. We file a motion to compel, he said, and we ask the court to draw an adverse inference from the incomplete production. I didn't know what adverse inference meant in technical terms. Gerald explained it simply. If a party fails to produce documents they were required to produce, the court may assume those documents contained something unfavorable to that party. So the missing records work in our favor, I said. Potentially, yes, Gerald said. It depends on the judge, but it is not nothing. I thanked him and hung up and sat with that for a while. Somewhere in 18 months of missing bank statements was whatever Richard and Sandra had not wanted anyone to find. And the fact that they hadn't produced those records meant they had made a choice. A panicked choice. The choice of people who had expected the matter to end in that gray conference room and were now discovering that it had not. They had underestimated me, and now they were leaving tracks. They came on a Sunday. I say they, because it was not just Richard. It was Richard and Dale, his brother, and, which surprised me and then didn't, Patrick, my son. The three of them pulled into my driveway at 2 p.m, which told me the visit had been organized, the timing selected, because Sunday afternoon carries the implication of civility, of things being worked out over coffee rather than litigated in a courtroom. I saw them through the kitchen window before they knocked. I stood there for a moment, watching them come up the walk. 3 men who, between them, represented 40 years of my life in different proportions. And I felt a specific kind of sadness, not weakness. Sadness is not weakness. Sadness is just accurate. I opened the door before they knocked. Richard looked rested. He had lost a little weight, which I noticed without feeling anything about it. He was wearing the blue shirt I had always liked on him, which I suspected was not an accident. "Dorothy," he said. His voice had the warmth of a man making an effort, which was its own information. "Can we come in?" I stepped back and let them in. I did not offer coffee. I sat at the kitchen table and folded my hands and waited. Dale spoke first, which also told me something. Richard had decided that Dale should open, perhaps because Dale had a talent for sounding reasonable while saying unreasonable things. He said that the family had been talking. He said that this legal process was hurting everyone, dragging the grandchildren into it, which was not accurate since our grandchildren had not been mentioned in any filing, but was clearly meant to produce an emotional response. He said that Richard was prepared to be more than fair if Dorothy would agree to step back from what was becoming an adversarial process that serves only the lawyers. Then Patrick spoke. That was the hardest part. My son looked at me from across the kitchen table in the house where I had raised him and said, "Mom, I think Dad has a point. You got a fair settlement. You've got the house. Why is this still going on?" I looked at my son for a moment. He was 40 years old. He had my father's eyes and Richard's jaw and a particular quality of self-interest that I had noticed developing in him over the past decade and had not found the right way to address. I said, "Patrick, do you know what Hargrove Property Services is?" He shifted in his chair. "It's a business entity, Mom, a secondary LLC, that your father co-owns with a woman he's been involved with for 3 years," I said. "An entity that received over $200,000 in redirected revenue during our marriage. Revenue from the company I kept the books for 22 years, for no salary." Silence. Richard's jaw tightened. The warmth left his voice entirely, which I had been waiting for. "Dorothy, no. I said. I said it without raising my voice. I listened to the opener. I'll tell you what I think. You came here today because you are worried. You're worried because the missing bank statements are going to be found one way or another. And you're worried because your attorney has told you that the adverse inference motion has merit. And you're worried because Sandra Kowalski's attorney is going to prioritize Sandra Kowalski's interests over yours when it comes to it. You came here dressed in a blue shirt on a Sunday afternoon because you thought if you brought my son and your brother and sat in my kitchen and talked about grandchildren, I would feel surrounded enough to give up. Dale stood up. He was a big man, and he used it. You're making this into something it's not, he said. His voice had dropped. It was not quite a threat, but it was using the same grammar. You should think about what a court case like this does to a family, to Patrick's business, to Melissa's relationships, to your grandchildren's understanding of who their family is. There it was, not coffee and civility. This. I stood up too. I am 5'4" and 63 years old, and I stood up and I said, "Get out of my house." Dale looked at Richard. Richard looked at his hands. Patrick looked at the table. None of them moved immediately, which was its own kind of answer, and then Richard stood and said quietly, "We'll be in touch." And the three of them walked out. I locked the door behind them. I stood in the hallway with my back against it and let myself feel the fear. Because it was there. I won't pretend it wasn't. Dale's words about the grandchildren, about Patrick's business, about Melissa. Those were not empty. Those were calculated. These were people who understood leverage and were willing to use it. I stood in that hallway and felt afraid, and then I did something I had been learning to do for the past several months. I let the fear be information instead of instruction. They had come on a Sunday in a blue shirt with a sun as a prop. That meant they had nothing left but pressure. And pressure, I had learned, is what people apply when the situation is no longer under their control. I went to the kitchen, made fresh coffee, and called Carol. I told her everything, including Dale's comment about family consequences. "Write it all down tonight," Carol said. "Dates, times, who said what. If they come again, we may want to consider whether this constitutes witness intimidation." I wrote it down, every word. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late June. Carol had filed 3 motions: to set aside the original settlement, to compel complete production of the Hargrove Property Services records, and, on the basis of my written account of the Sunday visit, along with Dale Hargrove's presence at Carol's law office weeks earlier, a motion requesting the court to note a pattern of extrajudicial contact intended to influence a party to litigation. Judge Patricia Wexler was a woman in her early 60s with reading glasses on a chain and the air of someone who had heard every variation of every family story and had stopped being surprised by any of them. I had been told she was fair and methodical, which was what I wanted. I did not want sympathy, I wanted attention. Richard's attorney was a man named Clifford Barnes, who was expensive and smooth and had, Carol told me, a reputation for performing confidence very well. He opened by characterizing my motions as the retaliatory actions of a spouse who had freely and competently signed a settlement agreement and was now experiencing regret and financial anxiety. He used the word regret 4 times in his opening. He suggested that my role in the business had been supportive rather than substantive, and that my access to financial records did not constitute the kind of expertise necessary to interpret them. Gerald Townsend was our first witness. He sat in the stand with his folder and his quiet manner and answered Carol's questions with the precision of someone who had spent 30 years producing evidence in courtrooms. He walked through the methodology of his analysis. He explained what revenue redirection meant in practical terms. He showed the discrepancy between what Hargrove Landscaping had recorded as income and what Hargrove Property Services had received. He explained the significance of the missing 18 months of bank statements and what a court might reasonably infer from their absence. Barnes cross-examined Gerald for 45 minutes. It was not a good 45 minutes for Barnes. Gerald was unflappable in the way that people are unflappable when they are simply telling the truth about arithmetic. Then I was called. I had been dreading this. I won't pretend otherwise. Not because I was uncertain of the facts, but because I knew Richard would be sitting 8 feet away from me, and I would have to be Dorothy Elaine Marsh in front of him. Not his wife, not the woman who had made his meals and kept his books, but a witness, a person with standing. Carol asked me to describe my role in Hargrove Landscaping's financial management. I did. I described it comprehensively. The years, the software, the quarterly tax filings, the payroll records, the vendor relationships. I described the moment I first noticed revenue discrepancies. I described the documentation I had compiled. I described the Saturday afternoon I had found the lease agreement for Richard's apartment in March, before he had told me he was filing. Then Barnes cross-examined me. He started with the question of authorization. Had I been formally employed by Hargrove Landscaping? No. Did I have a professional accounting license? No. Did Richard know I had photographed the financial records? No. So you took documents that were not legally yours, Barnes said. I photographed records that I had personally created and maintained, I said. Records that documented income from a marital business during a marriage in which I was a legal partner. I did not take anything. I copied my own work. Barnes pivoted. He suggested that my compilation of financial data was selective, designed to support a predetermined conclusion. He asked whether I had ever discussed the secondary LLC with my husband. I told him I had not. And yet, Barnes said, leaning forward slightly, you claim to have been tracking these supposed discrepancies for 2 years. If you genuinely believed there was financial misconduct, why didn't you confront your husband? Because I knew he would stop if I confronted him, I said. Silence in the room. Barnes recovered quickly. He moved to his final line, a suggestion that my motives were entirely emotional and that the legal challenge was designed not to seek just compensation, but to cause reputational harm to a legitimate business. He made a mistake then. He introduced as an exhibit an email exchange between Richard and Sandra Kowalski about Hargrove Property Services. He intended to show that their communications were professional in nature, business-focused, purely transactional. But the email chain he introduced was longer than he had apparently reviewed in full. Carol caught it. She requested a 5-minute recess. Judge Wexler granted it. Carol walked to the exhibit table and read 3 pages into the chain. She came back to our table and set the papers down in front of me without a word, pointing to a paragraph with one finger. I read it. It was an email from Richard to Sandra, dated 14 months before he had sat me down at the kitchen table. It said, and I am not quoting it exactly here, but giving you the substance of it, that the business restructuring would be complete within 6 months, that his attorney had advised him the LLC structure was sound, and that Dee doesn't look at anything she doesn't create herself. She'll never think to check. Dee, that was me, Dorothy. He had written, in a business email, that I would never think to check. Carol requested permission to redirect based on newly reviewed evidence in the defendant's own exhibit. Judge Wexler said yes. When Barnes realized what had happened, that his own exhibit had introduced the most damaging evidence in the case, he objected on grounds that were, Carol later told me, not legally applicable to the situation. The objection was overruled. Richard, who had been sitting straight in his chair for 2 hours, put his hand over his mouth. Sandra Kowalski's attorney, who was sitting in the gallery, stood up and said something quietly to her colleague. I did not look at Richard. I looked at Judge Wexler, who was reading the email carefully, and I watched her face settle into the expression of someone who has just understood the precise shape of a thing. The hearing did not end with a dramatic verdict. That is not how these proceedings work. But Judge Wexler granted all 3 of Carol's motions at the close of the hearing. The original settlement was vacated. The complete production of Hargrove Property Services records was compelled under penalty of contempt, and the court noted in writing the pattern of extrajudicial contact. Richard's attorney asked for a 30-day extension to respond. Judge Wexler gave him 15. I walked out of that courthouse on a Thursday morning in late June and stood on the steps in the Texas heat and felt the sun on my face and said nothing to anyone for a full minute. Carol stood beside me. She didn't speak either. She understood. Then she said, "They are going to settle, and they are going to settle well." They settled 6 weeks later. Barnes had spent 2 weeks attempting to argue that the email from Richard's own exhibit was contextually mischaracterized, and that the revenue discrepancy had an alternative explanation involving a permissible business restructuring under Texas tax code. Gerald Townsend took those arguments apart in a supplemental report that ran to 19 pages. Sandra Kowalski's attorney, protecting her client's separate interests, declined to support Barnes's alternative explanation, which meant that Richard's defense depended on a story that his own co-owner was not willing to endorse in writing. The missing 18 months of bank statements were produced under the court's compulsion order. Gerald reviewed them over 4 days. The final figure was not $214,000. It was $387,420. Revenue redirected from Hargrove Landscaping into the LLC across a period of 31 months during our marriage. Revenue from work I had helped administer, from client relationships I had partially managed, from a business that existed in the form it did because of decades of unpaid labor that Texas family law, as Carol explained it to me, could recognize as a marital contribution even without a salary attached. Richard's attorney conveyed his client's terms for settlement on a Wednesday afternoon. I was in Carol's office. The terms were as follows: full transfer of the marital home to Dorothy, free and clear, $300,000 in cash settlement, spousal maintenance of $4,500 per month for 8 years, transfer to Dorothy of a 30% ownership interest in Hargrove Landscaping, to be bought out at a court-appraised value within 90 days, which Gerald estimated would yield an additional $112,000. I did the math in my head at the table. The total value, house, cash, maintenance over 8 years, buyout, was approximately $1.2 million. The settlement I had originally signed in that gray conference room had been worth approximately $250,000 if the house sold at its estimated value. I looked at Carol. "Is there anything we should push back on?" I asked. "The maintenance period could potentially be extended," she said. "But I think you'll find 8 years is workable." I thought about it for a moment. I thought about what I wanted, not what I was owed, not what they deserved, not what would cause the most consequence. What I wanted was to be done. "Accept it," I said. The papers were signed the following Tuesday. Richard was not in the room. He participated by phone, through Barnes. I had thought I might feel something significant when it was final, some version of the grief or the relief I'd been carrying for the past year. What I felt was closer to the feeling at the end of a long physical task, like when you've moved furniture or turned a garden bed and the work is finished and you are tired in a clean way and the room looks different than it did before. I shook Carol's hand. I thanked Gerald, who was there in a supporting capacity, and he nodded in the way of people who do careful work and are satisfied when it comes out right. I drove home. I stopped at the grocery store on the way and bought real food: a chicken, vegetables, a good loaf of bread. I cooked dinner for myself that evening, something I had not done properly in months, and I ate it at the kitchen table by the window where the light came in, and I thought about the next few months. Sandra Kowalski's situation resolved separately, as such things do. She had been a co-owner of an LLC built partly on redirected marital assets, and while she was not a party to the divorce proceedings, the exposure of those financials had implications for her own tax filings, implications that her attorney was, according to Carol, addressing with some urgency. Her involvement with Richard did not survive the legal proceedings. I know this not because I tracked it, but because Melissa told me, months later, in the offhand way she reported information she thought I deserved to have. Patrick called me 2 weeks after the settlement. He said he was sorry. He didn't specify for what, exactly, whether for Sunday afternoon in the kitchen, or for the 8 months of managed distance, or for something larger and harder to name. I told him I accepted his apology and that I loved him, and that I expected us both to need some time. He said he understood. It was a truthful conversation, which was a start. Richard Hargrove sold Hargrove Landscaping within the year. I was told, again not because I sought the information, that he sold it at a lower valuation than anticipated, partly because the forensic review had disrupted several client relationships and one commercial contract had not been renewed. He moved to a smaller house. The cedar cologne smell, I assumed, went with him. I did not feel sorry for him. I want to be honest about that. He had spent 3 years building a mechanism to ensure I would have nothing, and he had done it with the confidence of a man who understood exactly how little he had credited me. The outcome that followed was not cruelty on my part. It was consequence. There is a difference. I have thought about it often enough to be sure. 18 months later, I was sitting on the back porch of my house, in a way it had never quite felt before, drinking coffee in the early morning and watching a pair of cardinals work the feeder I had hung from the old pecan tree. I had repainted the living room in October, a soft sage green that Melissa had helped me choose over a Saturday that involved 3 paint samples and 2 good glasses of wine. I had bought a new reading chair. Small things, but mine. The financial settlement had not made me wealthy. That is not the kind of story this is. The cash, the house, the business buyout, and 8 years of maintenance had given me something I had not had at any point in my adult life: security that did not depend on anyone else. I engaged a fee-only financial planner named Harriet Bloom, referred by Carol, and together we invested the lump sum conservatively and structured the maintenance payments to cover my expenses without touching the principal. I went back to work in a small way. Part-time bookkeeping for one of Carol's colleagues, 2 days a week. It was not about the money, though the money was not unwelcome. It was about re-establishing a fact I had allowed to become unclear, that I had real skills, and they had value beyond my own kitchen. Pat Delvecchio and I started taking a weekly morning walk, which became the organizing social fact of my week. An hour of movement and conversation, and the specific comfort of being known by someone who had watched your life from close enough to see the underside of it. Melissa moved back to Dallas in the spring, 12 minutes from my house. We had dinner twice a month, attended the same church, and she called on Sunday mornings in a way that became the quiet texture of my week. Patrick and I repaired ourselves slowly, the way adult relationships repair. Not in a single conversation, but in accumulated small honesty. We were not the same as before, which I think was appropriate. But we were present to each other again. I will tell you what I know about the others, briefly and without satisfaction, as a motive. Richard moved into a 2-bedroom house in Allen. The sale of the landscaping business yielded less than he had hoped. The forensic audit's findings had become known in local business circles, and 2 commercial clients did not renew. He was managing, but at a much smaller scale than the life he had restructured our marriage to finance. Sandra Kowalski's LLC was dissolved. The tax implications of the undisclosed revenue resulted in a significant liability, and she left commercial real estate for a period before re-entering it in a different city at a more modest level. I don't tell you these outcomes to be unkind. I tell you because there is something true in them. People who build their futures on the assumption that someone won't notice, won't act, won't have the nerve to respond. Those people are not usually undone by dramatic reversals. They are undone by ordinary consequence, by the records that were always there, by the woman who kept them. On that morning, with the cardinals at the feeder and the coffee warm in my hands, I thought about what Richard had written in that email. Dee doesn't look at anything she doesn't create herself. He had been right that I didn't look at things I didn't create. He had simply forgotten that I had created everything that mattered. I poured a second cup of coffee. The morning was ordinary and mine, and I was in no hurry at all. Looking back, I can tell you the lessons I carried out of that experience, the ones that settled into me like stones into soil. The first, document everything. Not out of suspicion, not out of fear, but because a woman who knows the numbers can never be told she doesn't exist. Paper is memory that doesn't fade. The second, patience is not the same as surrender. I signed that settlement, and Richard smiled, because he read my silence as defeat. Silence can be a waiting room. Know the difference. The third, the people who underestimate you will always leave tracks. Arrogance is careless. Richard wrote in an email that I would never think to check. That sentence cost him nearly $1 million. So I want to ask you directly, and I want you to think about it honestly. If you had been sitting in that gray chair, with your husband's attorney sliding papers across the table and your own attorney beating her fist and telling you to fight, what would you have done? Would you have signed? Would you have walked out? Would you have had the records ready? Leave your answer in the comments. I read everyone, and I mean that. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe.